Hello, this is Lee Murphy speaking, the artist behind and the creator of Art by Lee Murphy, with another in my series of video talks about the advice and tips and tricks of things that I wish I had known when I was first starting out as an artist. This is a follow-up to getting your work into juried shows, and it kind of segues into that. It covers a little bit of overlap. Here we have on the easel, this is a 30 by 22 watercolor, and I should make a little aside here that when you are listing visual arts, when you are applying to shows or cataloging in any sort of way, you always start with the vertical and then the horizontal, and in the case of three-dimensionals, then the depth. That is how most catalogs and art registering services want to see your work, and it helps people who have not had any familiarity with your work to understand things with a certain degree of standardization. Anyhow, this is a watercolor that I chose for this particular video because it's the only one I have right now in my current possession that has been in multiple museum shows. This is how to get your artwork into museum shows, or displayed in a museum, because it's a broader topic than you might think. This one had been in a solo museum show, art museum show of my own, and it's also been in my latest, the last time I ever entered the Springfield Art Museum's Watercolor USA show in the Springfield, Missouri. So there's multiple ways to go about doing this. But before I get to that too, here's another example. Usually with watercolor, I do something called a float mount. This is actually a window mat mount. And I compromised on this because, to tie into my last video about getting into juried shows, follow the directions. The Springfield Watercolor USA prospectus specifically asked for not float mounting watercolors, because generally they are not as securely fastened and they tend to come apart in the frame on shipping, because very few people are able to hand deliver their work, and shipping companies do all kinds of crazy things with artwork, and I can cover that in a separate video when it comes to the specifics of safely and affordably shipping artwork anywhere all over the world. Anyhow, so I mounted this in a window mat, which is not my preference because I like for everything I paint to be seen. But that was their rules, it's their place, it's their game, so that's what went. This is a transparent watercolor on 140-pound cold-pressed watercolor paper. For that specific show, this is where there's an overlap between this and my last video about getting into juried shows. A little bit more nuance. After you've covered the concepts of following the directions exactly and doing exactly as they want and making sure as honestly and objectively as you can, deciding if your work really is a good fit. And that's a hard thing to do because we really do identify with our work more than we should. And it's a really hard thing to be rejected. Rejection is a basic human aversion on any point. But I'd say you get used to it, but you really kind of don't get used to getting your work rejected. You just handle it better. Anyhow, so I had figured out, for example, Springfield Watercolor USA show, they generally tend to favor transparent watercolor, but they like to see it handled in a non-traditional way. As you can see, I like to use a lot of bold colors, and this pop art theme seem to resonate with them. That is a basic concept. If you can take the scope of your work and take something ordinary and portray it in a really unusual or unordinary way, you have a better chance of having show jurors look at it, because they do tend to be a little bit more on the academic side, and they do tend to be jaded, and so you kind of it's kind of a lowbrow way to go about it, but if you can jaggle their attention just a little bit, you've got a better chance. If you can get a judge or an award juror or even a lot of potential art buyers, if you have their attention for more than 5 minutes, you've got a much better chance of getting a favorable reaction from them. Anyhow, back to the idea of whether or not you really want to be in a museum show. Personally, I've had 6 solo museum shows. The last solo museum show, I had the entire art museum to myself. I cannot begin to tell you, I've lost count of how many group museum shows, art museum shows I've been in. And once again, everybody's motives for doing this are different, so I cannot even begin to wonder whether this is even for you, but I just put things out there for you to consider if you want to go this route. Just as with ordinary juried shows, there's a lot of time and money and effort and life energy spent on this, and where do you want it to get you? There are lots of art museums around the continental United States. For people in other countries, I imagine it could be something similar. That said, if you do a Google search, this is what I did. I first started with the art museums local around me because that made the most sense from a financial and practical standpoint. And it's always better to talk to curators and directors in person and to be open and honest and very practical on what it is you can bring to them. Museums are chronically underfunded, and they have a chronic problem with reaching the most amount of the general public as possible. So if you have something peculiarly odd that doesn't appeal to a lot of people, your chances aren't as good. They have to make all their dollars and all of their employee energies, all of their staff energies, they have to make it count as much as possible. So, going back to the Google search, I haven't done this in a while, but the last time I checked, there were about, at least 50 museums or more, art museums around the country. If you just Google it, you'll find out. Of those museums, I did a much longer, about a day-long search. I found about 20 or more of them that actually had on their websites, it's not particularly easy to find for an obvious reason, more than 20 of them had a page you could click on for artists to apply for a show in a museum. It's that simple. It's that simple, but it's also that complex too, because you really have to look at the scope of the museum. For example, this painting right here, if I were to apply to a museum that had to do with folk art, it would have no context for them to be interested in my work, so there's no point wasting their time or mine. So, of those particular museums I looked at, a smaller amount had a mission that would coincide with the type of artwork that I have, and it becomes a point of diplomacy and being a little bit more hands-on and interaction, getting to know the people and applying and asking questions to the people of that particular museums. Once again, you fill out your contact form exactly how they want it and take it from there and develop a thicker skin. That said, with the solo art museum shows that I have had, that's just the beginning of a very long journey. If you want to get your artwork into a museum, that's not going to be the next week. Most museums have their exhibit schedules planned out far in advance. Sometimes I've been lucky that the last museum show I was in, I was able to jump in where another artist had had to cancel for personal reasons, and I had all my artwork and all my resources ready to go, and I could jump and say, hey, yes, I can do it. I will be there on that time with everything. And that was very fortunate. There's a quote by George O'Keeffe, attributed to her anyway. I don't know, who knows really if she really said this, but words to the effect of always be ready, have enough artwork on hand to be able to field a show, at least 3 shows at any given moment. And that's a really tall order, but at least have enough to be able to field one show. The last show I had 47 works filling up a very small art museum, and not a lot of people could do it, but you have to be realistic that that's what people need. It's a huge responsibility, and if you commit to doing such a large show or something of that importance, and if you let them down in any sort of way, it's going to have a really bad effect on not just your artistic reputation, but your self-esteem and personal integrity. letting people down like that on a certain scale is, it's one thing to let our own selves down, but when there are other people whose livelihoods and reputations depend on it, that's a really big thing. And it's one thing we really have to keep, in mind with when our art reaches the public. Anyhow, if you really do want to go this route and you're committed to the time and the expense and the effort, because it's not just, here's all my artwork, go hang it on a wall and I'll show up for the opening. As with pretty much any other artistic venture, it is the responsibility of the artist to participate in the promotion. My last show, I was fortunate enough to have some patrons who were enthused and willing to loan their work to the exhibition. So that was one thing I could bring to the table with the museum staff and the director, and they were very happy. But once again, even a very small show, there's a lot of money involved and a lot of effort. And when your work is on the walls or in the exhibition halls, they have to choose yours and reject others. So it's a big responsibility. However, on my patron's standpoint, it suited them not just because they were happy to be supportive of me, and if you can manage to have enough supportive people around you, that's great, but not everybody can do that. But of the work that they were able to loan for this exhibition, it significantly, in their eyes anyway, increased its value. A lot of the part of the inherent value or the perception of value of art, once again, is bragging rights. As with pretty much any commodity that you literally don't need to eat or drink to survive. So much of human value is just on bragging rights and perceptions. Anyhow, take for example this watercolor. All it is colored goo on a piece of paper that looks like something that I've seen and hopefully looks like recognizable enough that someone else has seen to be able to groove on it. Anyhow, back to the nitty-gritty of art museum. Anybody can call anything a museum. You could get a storage shed and hang a sign on the wall and call it a museum. It's human perceptions. Anyhow, that I could go off into the philosophical deep end on that one, and people can take it where they will. So my point being is it's not really productive to hang everything, all of your resources and all of your hopes on having a museum show that, yay, I'm in a museum, this will make my career. No, it doesn't happen like that. You have to really work and push it. I know I left a lot of things undone with the museum shows I've had, and I have probably paid a big financial price for that, for future benefits, because I didn't work it as hard afterwards to leverage the publicity of the art museum to get myself in other places. I just was too ignorant, and still am too ignorant, working to rectify that. Anyhow, as with juried shows, I didn't put put this into the past video because there are always things I want to talk about when I'm finally shut off the video and I forget. So when you're applying to shows, and with museums especially, it does not benefit anyone to significantly edit photos of your work to make it look outstanding in order to impress whoever it is that's evaluating your work for an exhibition. If they say yes, and you have significantly gerrymandered your artwork digitally, and they see the real thing, and it does not measure up to what they were sent in a JPEG, chances are you will be rejected, and they will never, ever have a chance to get in that show again. With juried shows, there is a standard penalty of if you significantly break the rules of the show or the exhibition or exhibition standards and such, the penalty is to be blackballed or blacklisted from that show for a minimum of 2 to 5 or even more years, and sometimes if it's really egregious, you never get a chance to get in that show again. That's something to consider. But when it comes to why would anybody want to significantly gerrymander or edit artwork, for example, to get into a museum show when the curator sees the work? That's, there's no getting around that. So it was being open and honest as possible and realize you're working with this staff to present your work in the best way possible. So it helps to have their goodwill in every way that you can think of, even when it comes to, for example, I had to spend an enormous amount of money reframing and remounting a lot of the work I had to do for this last show. And that was all at my expense. But it was all my work. It was my choice to do it. It's not for the museum to decide that. Unless they want to offer it, then once again, you look at the pros and cons. If a museum or other venue wants to significantly alter the way you present your work, try to consider both sides of that argument and whether or not it is worth it for either one of us. Anyhow, I did manage to sell a few pieces off of the walls of the last show I had, but that's another thing to keep in mind as well, that even though a majority of the art museums are open to selling your work from the exhibition, it's well, of course, they really don't want it to come off the walls. There's no point in even asking for the artwork to come off the walls before the show is over, because that denies, it is a disadvantage to the people come in and see your work to see empty spots. It just doesn't look good. So when it comes to selling work from a museum show, it's generally agreed that the buyers will take delivery of the work after the show is over, which once again helps for bragging rights. But that's an individual consideration. So look at the fine print. Do a very close examination of, if you do want to go this route, find an art museum that's willing to consider your work, and if they accept it, work with the staff. I mean, there's always compromises that have to be made, but if you reframe that as a win-win, it's not I win, you lose, or you lose, I win. Come with a synthesis of developing a show, coming up with new ideas, coming up with ways, we're artists, for crying out loud, coming out with creative ways to solve problems that benefit everybody as much as possible. And then back to the idea of what I put forth in the Getting Into Juried Shows video, what is your intent afterwards? I did find a number of art museums that I would love to have had my work in, but once again, if they were thousands of miles away, what would be the projected benefit to all people involved? There was one way out in Wyoming that I would have loved to have done, but the expense would have been profoundly out of my affordability range, and it's an awful lot of risk. And if you look at it from the venue standards, it's nice to have an artist's work from a strange, exotic location, but what does it say to the people who go and see that show? Why would they want to see it? How is it a good fit? There's an awful lot of philosophical things questions to answer in our own minds when we decide to go this route, because it's not one that's taken lightly. It is expensive, and it can be very obviously beneficial for an artist's career, but it's also important to not hang too many of our hopes on, gee, I got my work in this building with a sign on that says Art Museum, and therefore I'm done. My career is made. That is really not the case. It is just a step in the way. Many things to consider, but it's not out of the realm of possibility for anybody, any artist, to at least consider having the work in an art museum show. It's not impossible. You don't have to be dead and buried for your work to get up there. There are plenty of smaller museums and larger museums all the way up. They have to have something to show. And maybe your work is exactly what they need. But it's, as with anything, consider every possible detail and look at all the pros and cons, especially the cons, because they can cost us an awful lot in the long run. Well, thank you for listening to this video, and I hope it was of some use. Thank you.